Hi, I'm Antonia. This is Universally Me. Please follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Antonia Carlotta, and please support my work on Patreon, patreon.com/Antonia Carlotta. Today I'm going to talk about one of my Uncle Carl's films, His Last Game. It's always really cool to stumble upon some of the oldest films. You know, when the film industry was starting, they really had no idea what it was going to become. So a lot of times once a movie was done, they would just throw it out or burn it up in order to make space for new films. And because of that, we now have all of these movies that we know existed at one point but are now lost. And even as I researched, I don't know if I expected that I was going to find that much about it. And, you know, in some ways I did and in some ways I didn't. But I did find two very real stories of two very real people from history that I believe inspired this film. And more than anything, that made this entire thing worth it. His Last Game is a short film that runs about 12 minutes. A summary of the film from one of its write-ups says, Bill Going, a Choctaw Indian, is scheduled to pitch in a baseball game against the Jimtown team. Gamblers try to bribe him to throw the game. A scrap results, and one of the gamblers is killed. The Indian pitcher is arrested, but released long enough to pitch his team to victory. And then comes the climax that will lift you right out of your seat. Honestly, as far as story goes, there are some plot holes, and it's definitely not perfect, but it was also 1909, so I guess it's not the worst film I've seen considering that. For those who want to watch it, I'm going to put a link below, and I'm also just going to give you a rundown of the film right now. When the movie opens, a member of the Choctaw tribe named Bill Going is standing outside waiting to pitch in the championship baseball game against Jimtown. And these two gamblers approach and they try to convince him to throw the game. They offer him coins and alcohol, and Bill thinks about it for a minute, but ultimately declines. I think it's worth noting that it's more than once in this film that Bill is tempted with alcohol, but he always ends up saying no. But the gamblers go off and they come back and they actually try to trick Bill into drinking. And so a scuffle ensues and Bill shoots one of them and he dies. And a sheriff comes and takes Bill away. So then we cut to Bill standing next to where his grave is being dug, and there's a firing squad nearby. And then this Choctaw man runs in and he's like, hey, can Bill go play in the game? And the sheriff's like, no. And the Choctaw man's like, okay. And then these white guys run in and they're like, hey, can Bill go play in the game? And the sheriff is like, no. But then the Choctaw man goes, well, what if I stay here and Bill can go play in the game? And then the sheriff's like, yeah, sure, I guess that sounds cool. And there's this darkly comedic moment where then, because Bill's going back to the game, both the Choctaw man and the sheriff place a bet on the game. Then the sheriff actually writes a note that says, if Bill wins the game, there is new evidence in his favor and he's innocent, which, no pressure. So Bill races to the game and he throws all of the winning pitches and the team wins. And his team carries him on their shoulders victorious all the way back into town. And just before Bill is about to take his celebratory shot, he suddenly remembers, I'm supposed to be executed right now. And he runs right back towards certain death. The sheriff is starting to get impatient and almost shoots the Choctaw man when Bill arrives. And the movie actually does a really great job here building the tension with some great edits between the sheriff who's readying the execution and Bill and the Choctaw man who are stalling, and a man that's on horseback racing to give the letter of Bill's reprieve. But ultimately, Bill is shot, and exactly as he falls into his grave, that's when the man on horseback rides over the hill and he's too late. It's actually a pretty dark ending. This film was the 7th film made by Imp, which was my Uncle Carl's production company before he started Universal. This was the company that he was running while he was fighting Thomas Edison, and because of when this was filmed, it's likely that this movie was shot in and around Fort Lee, New Jersey. I love these films where you can really tell what an experiment the film industry was back then. The editing is really choppy, the framing is usually off, so in some of the scenes, like, everything's happening up top. Like, people's heads are up here, just basically cut off. And like down here, that's just empty. It's ground. They didn't do anything there. And like you can tell, they have no idea how to shoot action or a baseball scene. They shot everything from one angle behind home plate. They have the other plate sort of smushed in at an awkward angle. And you can't really see much of the game anyway because their players' backs are in the way. Many people believe that modern baseball began in 1903 when the rules were standardized and the first World Series was scheduled. Now, even though this movie's 6 years later, I would bet that this is probably the first time that a lot of people were seeing baseball on screen. And even if it wasn't the best demonstration of it, I bet that it was still pretty special. I believe His Last Game was created out of two very real stories from 1897 and 1899. The first is the story of Watanish, who was a Choctaw tribal member and a pretty well-known baseball player in his region. He was a convicted murderer and was sentenced to execution by tribal members. His execution was scheduled on the same day as a baseball game, so he requested a stay so that he could play in one last game, and they let him. The second story that I think served as inspiration for His Last Game is the story of a real Choctaw man named William Going. William Going was the very last man to be executed under tribal laws in the Indian Territory. Following this, the Choctaw judge, sheriff, and deputies that carried out the execution were all actually arrested, and the territory had to follow federal laws. William Going had murdered his uncle about 2 years earlier, but in the time since, he had been allowed to travel with sports teams, to go to Cuba to fight under the Cuban flag in the Spanish War, and he even got married. But he still left all of that behind to show up for his execution day. As I said, I'm going to upload His Last Game on my channel, and I'll put the link below. So give it a watch. It's short, and I would love to know what you think of that, what you think of the real stories, and anything else that came up too. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Antonia Carlotta, and please support my work on Patreon, patreon.com/Antonia Carlotta. Thanks again. Bye.